Okay, here we go. Welcome, everybody, to Backyard Habitat in a Changing Climate with Deborah Marnich. I am delighted to introduce my colleague, CLC Stewardship Director, Deborah Marnich. She holds a BS in zoology and an MS in forestry. Her major interests and professional focus areas include combining wildlife and forestry practices to manage for both sound silviculture and optimum wildlife habitat, creating early successional and bird nesting habitat, pollinator habitat creation, promoting small diverse farms, local food production and agriculture, land conservation and protection, environmental education, and integrating all resource concerns to create a balanced conservation system. I have been very excited about this program. And welcome, Deb. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Juno, for that great introduction. And I wanted to thank everyone for joining us tonight, especially for giving up such a beautiful evening outside to join us for this very important and very timely topic, backyard habitat management for climate change. And we're going to start out with the basics here. Climate change for the current and the future. A few facts that we all know: sea level is rising, the temperature is rising. There are more natural disasters and erratic weather patterns, major storm events, drought, fires, and floods. And the Northeast US Climate Resilient Tool has told us that temperatures in the Northeast rose by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit between 1895 and 2011. And models predict in the region could see warming of 4.5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by 2080s. And that is assuming continued increasing emissions, of course. Regional perception increased by approximately 5 inches or more than 10% during the same period. So seasonal drought risk in the summer and fall is also projected to increase over the next century due to warming temperatures and earlier snowmelt. And we've also seen an example of this recently in our shocking 7+ inches of rain last week. So sea level is rising and people will be displaced. And this is a prediction for 2100. Due to sea level, researchers are starting to predict where people will go. So the areas most affected are in blue, and on the East Coast and the West Coast and the Gulf Coast, it looks like we could be even losing some major states along the East Coast, part of Massachusetts and New Jersey, almost the panhandle of Florida. People will migrate to the darker areas, the dark red areas. They'll be mostly affected, and the surrounding lighter areas a little bit less affected. However, the big message here is that the people will be displaced and there will be migrating that is going to happen from sea level rise. Not only will people be displaced, but animals and birds and amphibians will. This is Climate Migrations in Motion. This is from the Nature Conservancy. It's a prediction of as the climate changes and alters habitats and disrupts ecosystems, where the animals will move and survive, and how human development may prevent them. So the pink is mammals, the blue is birds, and the yellow is amphibians. Let's take a closer look at the United States. And you'll notice a pattern going on the East Coast, where everything seems to be merging. And at a closer look, we notice that all the colors are coming together and they're going right up the Appalachian corridor. And again, this is a Nature Conservancy program and model that was put together. And according to one of the studies on which the map is based, only 2% of natural areas east of the Mississippi are connected in a way that allows species to migrate north or up in elevation. And because of the dismal state of connectivity of habitats, a small increase in conserved land could provide major benefits in the region. And that brings me to my next topic, which is one of my favorites. This is so energizing to know that 120,000 landowners privately own over 75% of New Hampshire forest. Not only that, but there are 4.9 million acres of privately owned land in New Hampshire, and there are 6 million total acres in the state of New Hampshire. 6 million. And almost 5 million are privately owned. And this means that individually, you and I, and also on a very large landscape level, we can make a huge impact and a major difference. Because we own most of the land here, folks. And that's a great, great, invigorating fact. And with that, I tell you, your yard is a universe. Many small creatures can spend their whole life within the perimeter of your yard. So just think about that for a moment, the whole life within the perimeter of your yard. That means that their lives actually depend on you, no matter how large or small your property is. I recently took a course with the Nature Conservancy on climate change and forest adaptation resources. And the Forest Service has forest adaptation resources, climate change tools that they offered. And they've partnered with different organizations to create the Climate Adaptation Workshop, which offers strategies and approaches to climate change and adaptation. And it's created by the USDA Climate Hubs, the Forest Service, the American Forest, and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. And I wanted to base, I was so taken by this training, I thought it was great. The strategies were really important. It was for landowners. However, I've altered the program slightly to retrofit it for smaller landowners. And it's not based solely on forest land ownership, but I've integrated some gardening and actually small farming techniques for smaller properties. And I've adopted 7 strategies. And before we go through the strategies, I'd like to talk about the big concept. The big concept here, folks, is change. Change all around. Okay, there's factual changes that we just discussed: weather, temperature, sea level, migration with animals and with humans. And there are action items and idealistic changes that go along with all of that. Perceptions, methods, practices, ideas, and theories, future concepts and actions, historical concepts, actions, and beliefs. So there's really, really, in a social aspect, a whole lot to consider with climate change as well. And one of the topics I wanted to touch on, and it will be reoccurring in this topic, in this presentation, is the change or altering of what your garden or your lawn, quote, should look like. We have a lot of ideas based around this, and some of them are older ideas, some of them are newer ideas. However, this is a topic that will be reoccurring through the presentation as well. The photograph on the right of the nicely manicured lawn, it's this strip here along the house is actually probably the most diverse and valuable strip that's in the yard, with the trees and the bushes and the shrubs and the rocks and the flowering plants and the mulch. It's diverse. It offers vertical diversity, different species. However, to have a lawn that's really just 1 or 2 seed mixes is kind of a monoculture. So not that lawns are bad. We can have lawns in all kinds of big, diverse quantities, like different seed mixes, a conservation mix, adding clover, flowering plants for the pollinators. So this is another concept I'd like to introduce. And this is a garden at my house. I've hung my pollinator habitat sign so my neighbors don't dislike me. I'm trying to tell them that this messy barrel behind them with all these stems sticking out and the leaves on the ground, it's been planted with concerns of pollinator friendly flowers and habitat, and that it's okay. It's okay to leave that. And I'll explain more about why leaving habitat in that type of condition is really, really important. Okay, let's roll right into climate adaptation strategy number 1. It's going to be to sustain fundamental ecological functions. And this means reduce impacts on soil and encourage the nutrient cycle, reduce competition for moisture, nutrients, and light, maintain or restore hydrology and riparian areas if you are fortunate enough to have a lake or a stream or an intermittent stream on your property. Before we start with the strategies, I wanted to note that I am one of the small landowners in New Hampshire, and that 90% of the following real-life examples of climate adaptation practices happened on 1.5 acres right here in Carroll County. And that I know that because it happened on my property. Okay, we'll start out with soil quality. Should strive to improve soil quality and protect it. And this means, yes, no naked soil year-round, folks. That means winter, spring, fall, and summer. Your soil should always be closed and protected with some type of mulch layer. So protect your soil from wind and water erosion and nutrient loss. Also, amend your soil with leaf mulch, compost, and nutrients to maximize soil health, because soil health is a real thing. We cannot keep taking from the soil and not giving back. There are natural nutrient cycles that happen, and leaves are actually one of those natural nutrient cycles. They're high quality, free, natural soil amendments containing phosphorus, carbon, nitrogen, and potassium, and many other micronutrients. I believe 12 other micronutrients. But the real important thing about leaves is they are a slow release of nutrients that happen naturally every year. So rather than putting fertilizer onto your soil and applying certain amounts that could run off and carry phosphorus, the leaf is the big bang for the buck in the future. It lasts, gradually releases nutrients and lasts longer over a period of time. Also ensure your soil is a home for living organisms. Living organisms actually make up a part of soil and a certain percentage of it. So they're in the soil percentage when it comes to what the soil is comprised of. They create airspace, water space, and they're moving about and functioning in your soil. And without living organisms, your soil is not quite as healthy. So protect them as well with the mulch. Reduce competition for moisture. Again, we've got straw mulch on a garlic bed, works pretty well, and that stays on year round again. And cover cropping or mulch for moisture retention, erosion control, nitrification, and pollinator habitat. So this is red and white clover, and it's between the walking rows and our raised beds, and we definitely let it flower, go to seed, and it works very nicely to protect the soil, enhance it, and also provide pollinator habitat. Okay, climate adaptation strategy number 2, rethink the way we garden and grow food. And the end goal of this is to limit or eliminate watering. So when building a garden, we need to think about moisture as the first concern or component and build the garden around that. Also, change irrigation methods to either drip irrigation and other more effective watering systems such as rain barrels or other watering collection systems. Again, the end goal is to limit or eliminate watering. Mulch, 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 and mulch again. Straw and leaf mulch, and you can use newspaper or cardboard as well. And we do caution against dyed bark mulch. Consider row covers to keep out pests and shade crops. And locate gardens in part shade areas on the landscape to create vertical diversity within the garden itself. And I have examples of each one of these. And first, I'd like to introduce a concept of gardening that is called hugelkultur. A hugelkultur garden has been around for quite some time, centuries in Germany. The theory is that you will be adding, it's actually, the word hugelkultur means mound garden or mounded bed. And the theory is that you would layer different layers like bulky organic material, actual tree trunks, branches, roots, and shrubs in the bottom layer. You could slice out this bottom layer, and then you could face the turf upside down on top of that with the grass, and then you add a humus layer. And you plant your plants in that with the idea that the bulky organic material in the very bottom of the garden is going to decompose, and as it does, it's going to provide nutrients and it's going to hold all kinds of moisture. So there's very little watering needed or required in this garden. Again, it's hugelkultur. It means a mounded bed or mound culture. And this is really what it looks like in real life. This would also provide opportunities for ergonomic gardening. And, you know, it does look kind of strange. I would like to note a few things. We're not used to seeing this in somebody's yard, okay? It's kind of like, you know, something that looks like an alien form of gardening. But that's one of the concepts we're thinking about tonight when we introduce these low watering systems and things that may, adaptations that may get us into the future with drier climates. I'd also like to note this is all hay mulch to protect, probably straw mulch to protect all the vegetables and all the flowers in it. And the soil that's mounded up, you'd like to mulch it so it doesn't erode. And this is a lower form. There's all different types of hugelkultur gardens. This is a lower bed. And what they did here was, you can see the wood additions right in the center of the garden. They mounded some soil, and we've got straw mulch and also some garlic planted in. So a water saver and a nutrient processor, a long-term garden, basically. Long-term planning. So this is a type of hugelkultur garden, but it's more like a rain garden. And this we built in our backyard. We had a very low area that was catching runoff off the edge of the yard. And we basically used materials that we had from the yard, all of our materials. It's kind of a permaculture situation where you're using materials that are naturally around, that would naturally be processed and decomposed in nature. We have the layer of trees and woody debris, grass and twigs and leaves. We incorporated rocks and stumps because we ended up cutting a bunch of trees when we moved in. And this was in the summer of 2022. And after we incorporated everything, we seeded it, we hay mulched it, right? Straw mulched it, and put a layer of soil on top, seed and straw mulch. And this is what it looked like in the spring of 2023, very early spring. I believe this was April of this year. But there was a green plant, one of the flowers that I planted that actually is coming up. And it's attached to an older water garden that we had in the yard, which actually contains most of our herbs. And we have flowers in pots, and all of the hollowed out stumps are planted in with either strawberries or an arrangement of pollinator flowers. And basically, It's based on the hugelkultur concept, but it's more of a rain garden at this point. It's permaculture. It's using resources you have in your yard that are natural and incorporating into a gardening situation. And there are layers of things going on here, layers of different plants and different herbs, and there will be vegetables in there eventually. This is another example of a garden that we made probably 7 years ago in a low-lying area in our yard. And again, folks, I want to go back for a moment and pause to the idea or concept of what a garden or what your yard should look like. Now, I know sometimes our neighbors are wondering about us, but I tell you, these are some of the most diverse gardens I've really ever seen. And as I mentioned, there is very little watering required. There are literally layers of different plants and vegetables and crops in this garden as well. We've got most of our garlic that's straw mulch right here. There's onions up front. There are actually irises and lilies are planted in a lot of these stumps. Blueberries, planted in the back, big stumps. Fox and heather is ground cover and pollinator habitat, incorporating rocks again, because they hold lots of moisture. And there was a layer of strawberries up front here in the garden that's almost in stumps that have almost by this point sunk into the ground. So eventually things are going back into the ground. You can turn them in, you can rework the garden, you've built your soil. And if you look on the right, in this picture on the right, our garlic is here, it's straw mulch, the lilies are coming up, but actually there are fungi on the stumps. So that is okay. That's probably another concept that people don't really like when they're gardening, to have things like this incorporated like fungi into their garden. We have it all here. And my idea is that the natural system, if it's allowed to proceed, will actually take care of itself. And we'll get more into that when we talk about pests and insects. Also, you could straw bale garden to save water and recycle. You can plant your plants, tomatoes do well in straw bales, and afterwards recycle in the compost pile, the straw bale as well. And it holds a lot of moisture. Again, I mentioned vertical diversity in gardens. They save moisture and promote diverse layers. And so here we like to incorporate peas into our garden on the western side where the sun sets to kind of filter the light. And on the eastern side, we have garlic that also kind of filters the light. It's a busy garden. The soil, we're trying to max out the capability of the soil, but however, creating vertical diversity also acts somewhat as a mulch and saves moisture as well. So we also added greenhouse hoops and cover with greenhouse fabric. You can use a shade cloth if it's too hot to cover for moisture, save moisture, and that would also keep insects out as well. And of course, a pollinator or insectivore strip that provides flowering plants throughout the season. Again, this is right in our little raised bed. It kind of exploded and took off. However, it's been a really nice resource. It attracts all kinds of insects. And again, vertical diversity creation. And the idea is with this strip, you're having a flower that's blooming every single season, early spring, middle spring, late spring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always a source of pollinator food in your garden. Okay, and we love to incorporate rocks into the garden design. The concept is they hold moisture and provide a cool, wet habitat for plants and animals. And this becomes even more important in a changing climate. And drip irrigation and rain barrels are a more effective way to irrigate or provide water to a garden. You can do it yourself, rain barrel, which is very reasonable, economical. Probably run you about $30. Go ahead and get this stuff from your local hardware store and set it up, or you can do drip irrigation that actually, rather than irrigating from above or watering with a hose, where a lot of the moisture gets evaporated, the drip irrigation is a slow drip that goes right into the soil. It's more effective in wetting the soil and keeping it wet over long periods of time. And our last adaptation consideration was if you were lucky enough to have a stream or a lake or live near a lake or any type of intermittent stream, maintain and restore hydrology. A concept, here's another concept, lots of concepts tonight that we're not used to, is adding wood to a stream to improve habitat, floodwater recharge, and slow sedimentation to improve water quality. Historically, we've been pulling wood out of streams to increase the flow, and really when we do that, it just does the opposite. As you can see here, this down log has created a bunch of sediment and actually created a pool on the downside of it. So, and it would also, if there were floodwaters coming through, provide a floodwater recharge area on both sides of the stream. And it's just a great practice that, and a concept I'd like to introduce that maybe a lot of people really don't think about, but it's really, really a game changer with habitat improvement. Okay, we'll move on to climate adaptation strategy number 3. And this is to reduce the impact of biological stressors, maintain or improve the ability of ecosystem to resist pests and pathogens, improve ecosystem diversity, and prevent the introduction and establishment of invasive plant species, and remove existing invasives. So this looks familiar to a lot of people. Over the last 2 years, we've had the spongy moth outbreak. And this is actually, at least Conway has had a really, really severe episode of this. And this is a picture of them laying eggs, spongy moths laying eggs on a birch tree. So there's a lot of pressure put on many different types of species of trees in the area. I even had firs and pines that were really, really under a lot of stress due to spongy moths devouring them. So the idea here is to diversify your ecosystem so it will take care of itself in a natural process to include beneficial insects, predators, and leave the leaves, leave the habitat, and leave the buffer so they can live in them. Predators of the spongy moth include birds, mammals, parasitic insects, and beetles. It's not completely going to reduce the pressure entirely, but it does make a difference. And as I mentioned, leave the leaves in the natural habitat layer. This is so important with insects. Many insects live in or just below the leaf layer. And here's another concept that I want to throw out while we're on the topic of concepts. A lot of times people want to do annual cleanup in the garden or cleanup before winter or cleanup in spring, which is great to a certain extent. However, I think it's a human theory where we think that plants will not come through this leaf layer. They do. Even flowers as delicate as crocuses will come right through. I can vouch for this because this year I left my leaf layer as I normally do, and all of my plants are coming up right through it. Every single type, it doesn't matter. And if you leave that, it's a nice resource, a slow nutrient release. You're creating soil and a great layer for years to come. So most bumblebee queens nest just below the ground or under piles of brush in the winter. So it's another benefit of leaving the leaves and leaving the layers. Okay, again, an example of leaving the plants over winter and resist cleaning up gardens until spring temps have reached a constant 50 degrees. So the picture on the left is the garden with the seed heads of multiple flowers and plants that the birds will utilize and the rodents through the winter. The pithy stems, a lot of sweat bees love to nest in stems like this. So it's really important. They get broken off with winter snow and stuff, and they get broken early on, and there are insects nesting in them and using them as habitat. So resist the cleanup. And moving on to prevent invasive pests and plants. This is a pest that we don't have in New Hampshire yet. And the spotted lanternfly took this picture in New Jersey, where they do actually have a huge outbreak of this going on. And you want to avoid planting the tree of heaven. It's an invasive, a non-native plant, and it's a preferred species of the spotted lanternfly. So you also want to check your nursery stock before you purchase it, because that's where they're coming in, the state and the country, on nursery stock. So just be aware what you're buying, what you're planting to prevent the invasives. All right, we'll move on to climate adaptation strategy number 4. Maintain and enhance species and structural diversity. This is really important all over your yard and all over the forest. Promote diverse age classes, maintain species and restore the diversity of native species, retain biological legacies, and that means mature trees, snags, and down logs. And this is one of my favorite topics. This is an example of multiple age classes of trees. Again, all on the 1.5 acres. We have a mid-story level coming up under some younger trees. We have a biological legacy tree, and we have understory regeneration starting up on an edge. So it's all good different age classes to maintain. Okay, and this is where it gets a little bit crazy, folks, but I really couldn't help myself with an SOS to save our stumps. Plants, lichens, mosses, fungi, salamanders, snakes, frogs, insects, and a variety of many other animals utilize stumps for habitats, food, shelter for many, many years. And how many years, you say? Many years. It's not this slide, but it's the next one. I just wanted to mention, maintain woody material, stumps and down logs. They all equal moisture. And this little American toad found a spot in a stump in my yard. Back to how long should we maintain? How long does this woody habitat last, you ask? The nutrient cycle, the decomposition rate of downed wood. Conifer species will last 57 to 124 years, and hardwood species will last 46 to 71 years. That is up to 124 years of habitat for multiple plants, animals, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, etc. And possibly 71 years if you've got a hardwood species. So you really get a big bang for the buck on the down logs and the stump habitat. So and they hold moisture. They're moisture holders. They're sinks for moisture, and fungi and mosses, which hold moisture. So we're looking to hold moisture in the future. Okay, maintain snags and dead standing woods for wildlife and insect condos. We have quite a few trees in the yard that look like this. They're about to fall on the fence, and someday they will. You know, that's okay. We'll fix the fence and we'll move on with it. But right now, it's for this hardwood maple is providing a lot of habitat for many different species. And if you'll pay attention to this picture on the right, this is a large popple tree that is probably completely hollow on the inside and ready to blow over at any point in time. However, keep your eye on it. And here you'll see, much to my amazement, that we had a hen, wood duck, and chicks nesting in this tree last year. And they are back this year. She's back this year. She's sitting on a nest right now. probably 13 or 12 eggs. That's what she had last year. I hope she's as successful this year. And I could not get an effective picture of her chicks because they were running around so quickly when they did hatch. So this is some pretty amazing habitat to offer on our tiny 1.5 acres. We are loving that's happening. Okay, so if you don't have the nesting opportunities, you want to create cavities and nesting opportunities. However you will, nest boxes, and this is a bee nest box. So a lot of little sweat bees that have sealed off these little tunnels and they're in there nesting, overwintering. And nest boxes they provide a use for every season, for nest in the summer, but also there was some type of hoarder that smashed all these mushrooms into the box over the winter when I opened it to clean it out this spring. Probably a red squirrel or a blue jay or a flying squirrel, something like this. So, all right, we'll move on to climate adaptation strategy number 5. Promote landscape connectivity. And this one was a really important one because lots of animals were traveling up the Northeast corridor along the Appalachian Range. But they're also traveling right in your backyard as well. So we want to reduce landscape fragmentation and maintain and create habitat corridors. So this is my property, and this is the north side of the property. There's a pretty large swath of forest on the north side. In the center of the property, it's more of an open use type of lawn area. And on the south side of the property, there's another large swath of forest. There are buffers on each side of the center of the property. So at any point in time, animals are using these swaths of forest and these buffers to travel. My neighbors have the same buffers down off the road, as you can see in the center of the property. So they're communally using these buffers to travel around properties. I've seen bears come through here, bobcats, deer, you name it. So provide the habitat connectivity. That's an important one. Okay, moving on to climate adaptation strategy number 6. Facilitate community adjustments through species transition or assisted migration. So favor or restore native species that are expected to be adapted for future conditions when the weather changes. Introduce species that are expected to be adapted to the future conditions. Protect future adapted seedlings and saplings that are coming up naturally. Manage for species with wide moisture and temperature tolerances. So these are all, again, in the big picture concepts to consider when managing for tree species and other species in your yard. So this is a list of tree species that will be adapted to future conditions. It's from the Northern Institute of Adapted Climate Science. And let's take a closer look, blowing it up a little bit so you can see that really our poor capability trees like balsam poplar, balsam fir, black ash, some of the oaks, and some of the birches, some of the cherries, striped maple and tamarack, they're not going to be doing well in the future. However, there's the fair capabilities and the good capability trees as well that are going to make it. There's mixed results, but this is interesting. New habitat with migration potential. So there's some of the southern oaks that are coming up. This is interesting. Cucumber tree, which I learned was actually magnolia, and I never really knew that. Maybe based on the blooms and how they look, like a cucumber possibly. Red buds and Osage orange and the southern oaks, they're actually going to potentially migrate as the temperature changes. So that's interesting theory. Again, a large concept to consider when managing for climate change. Some species you can consciously consider and choose what trees to plant and plants to promote future survival. American chestnut is predicted to do well in a warming climate, and also white oak is predicted to do very well. And we've made it to climate adaptation strategy number 7. And that is to realign ecosystems after disturbance, because we're having storm events and we're having larger disturbances. So it suggests revegetating sites after disturbance so you don't get invasives, or allow for areas of natural regeneration to proliferate. And so this was a disturbed area along the road. Some trees fell down, and white pine is coming in heavy in saplings. So you want to encourage that and let that come in, because that's what wants to come in there. It's native, it's happening, and it's a good method of reforesting. So we're nearing the end of the presentation. But before I leave, I wanted to say, seek out grants or cost share programs to assist with costs, because as we know, land management can be expensive. However, if you're using materials on your property that you already have, it's not quite as costly. But if you aren't, and you don't have those, you have larger properties or want to consider funding options, you can check out USDA, NRCS, federal cost share, and federal grant opportunities, New Hampshire Fish and Game Small Grants Program, Conservation Districts of New Hampshire. They offer different programs, and also disaster assistance with the USDA Farm Service Agency. And on my final note tonight, folks, I just want to leave you with one other very large concept and thought. You may ask, how do you know that your property is diverse and resilient? And I could say for a fact that I think your property will tell you. It will tell you by the species of animals that show up, by the species of amphibians and invertebrates and insects and birds and fungi. It's just something you will know. When you have a diverse ecosystem, you will have diverse fauna and flora. And that's it for tonight.
Thank you so much. This is everything that gets me excited. I have questions, but do other people have questions? You can raise your hand, you can type them in the chat, and you can unmute and ask them. I hate to ask you to stop screen sharing on this gorgeous image, but then maybe we can see everybody.
Sure thing.
So until I see a hand, I'm going to ask a couple questions. You said you talked early on about locating gardens in part shade areas to create diversity, or you might have said to create like different levels. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think the plants would have to also be adapted to a little bit of part shade that you choose to put in those areas. I notice that sometimes my lettuce does better when it gets morning sun and it doesn't bolt out, say when it has a full day of full sun and gets dried out. And the vertical diversity piece I was talking about was say planting peas, incorporating them maybe on the outside of the garden so they can provide somewhat of a shade to different angles of light coming in, say when the sun's setting, when the sun is at its hottest, and at the end of the day, and to cover most of the areas with plants so that moisture is still, there's a lot, the soil's shaded and protected more. If that answers your question. So yeah. I mean, my land is becoming more part shade, so I got hopeful hearing that. I was curious, in the really tall hugelkultur, in the hugel, it had wood kind of around, like it looked like pieces of pallets, or just was curious if that was like structural or letting little critters live underneath it, or if there's what specific purpose for that. I'm not quite sure, but I'm thinking it's more functional, like for people to stand on, and maybe an ergonomic thing, lift you up a little layer so that you have a little lift and you can stand and garden. It may be for drainage around the edge of it, so it doesn't kind of become a mess. Yeah, I'm thinking those might be some reasons.
And were you showing a kind of homemade drip irrigation, or was that just some kind of drip irrigation tape?
That was drip irrigation tape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Questions, anybody? Nice to see some faces. Wharton?
Yeah, sure, I'll go ahead. I have, we have a bit of woodland, and it's second growth, probably 50 to 70 years in from being pasture at one time. And we're basically doing nothing to it. And I'm just wondering whether there's any management or resources that we could refer to learn about ways to manage for sort of healthy wildlife populations. We have deer, there are bear around, there are bobcat, lots of birds, but I think we're doing fairly well just letting it do its own thing. But just want to get your thoughts on what we might want to consider there.
Sure, Wharton, I think that's a great question. I think there's always an option of hiring a consulting forester or working through NRCS to do that. If you might want a forest management plan, it'd be a great option to have an inventory on the woods of your property, but also a lot of foresters can recommend wildlife management plans or wildlife management practices, pardon me, as well. You may consider diversifying in areas, creating some openings that would then regenerate back into early successional habitat, which would be the hardwood species that move in, or the grasses and forbs that move in an opening, the very first species to come back in an opening. And that also creates edges along the openings, which are very important. And that's a great way for diversification. And if you had some trees you might want to remove, you might do that with a forest management plan and the use of a consulting forester. Or if you work through NRCS, they have consulting professional wildlife specialists that can write a wildlife management plan for you as well, and focus more on the wildlife practices, which are actually forestry practices when you really think about it. So I would start there. If you wanted to do some of those openings yourself, or diversify it in ways, selective cutting to allow different regeneration to come in. That would be something as well.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Lisa?
Sorry, my teenager just reminded me I was muted. Hi, Deb. That was a very interesting presentation. My neighbor recently logged the property adjacent to us. So we're having a bit of a Dr. Seuss moment here, where it's just so sad. And I, of course, planted a lot of the shared wood line area with shade, wildflowers, and I have a little trillium addiction. And any suggestions on how to come back from this?
Right, that just totally changed up your whole situation.
It did.
Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe, for the long term, planting conifers along that boundary line to kind of shade things out. Maybe a shade cloth for the exact moment, like right now, and for the long term, planting and conifers to shade to shade things out. You can even put up a pea trellis and plant some kind of vines if that would help shade things out over it quite a bit. But that's a tough one because when your shade situation automatically becomes sun situation and your plants aren't adapted, that kind of really switches things up for you. I'm trying to throw out my best options here. Build a shelter.
I appreciate that. My husband literally was like, he wants to move. So I think I need to talk him off the ledge, but we're looking at conifer options. And
Okay.
I did finally talk to the neighbor, and they supposedly are planning to replant the boundary basically. But you know, we'll be dead before they grow big enough, I think.
Right,
So
right.
thank you.
So-
Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thank you for attending. And I just had one more thought, Lisa. Maybe transplanting. You have a shady area, you could grab those plants, pick them up, transplant them if they'll transplant well, and then rearrange your sun plants or plant new ones. You know, you could seize the opportunity to introduce some sun-loving plants over there.
Good point. Thank you.
You bet.
There's a question in the chat regarding leaving leaf cover. Will doing that increase the numbers of mosquitoes and ticks? And what can be done naturally to limit those populations from increasing?
I do think that leaving leaf cover will increase every kind of bug you have. It is something to consider. However, maybe the turkeys will come through and they'll be really happy to eat those ticks that are in your leaf cover. It will make it more diverse for them. Maybe flocks of warblers may choose to feed on your property because now you've got, you know, bugs everywhere and black flies and such. You could leave an area of grassed area, a diverse lawn, not a monoculture, but a diverse lawn made up of lots of dandelions and conservation mix and all kinds of different types of grasses in and around your home, and then leave a feathered edge of, say, leaves on the outside of that so they're not in your immediate area. That's kind of what we do. There's a little bit of a diverse lawn area. There's those weird gardens that you saw, and then there's a little bit of a feathered edge leading into the woods. It's a nice escape zone for critters as well. It's a nice contrast and transition into the woods. It provides safe harbor, and believe me, the bugs don't really want to hang out much, you know, around your house anyway, unless you have water stored there or wet soil. You know, black flies, they love wet soil. So I have not noticed that it's horribly increased the bug population here.
Yeah, and I have been implementing some of these kinds of practices at my place for a number of years, and you really do. You see the turkeys come through, you see how much more wildlife is around, different kinds of birds, pollinators. I mean, as Deb says, and more native species coming in all the time, more plant medicine, more wildflowers, new things every year. It really is visible as you take these steps. Does anybody else have questions? There's a nice comment in the chat from Jean. Thank you, Jean.
Thank you so much.
If not, I will say thank you all for coming. Deb, thank you so much for sharing all of this. I'm excited that this is recorded so that people can have access to it in the future. And yeah, if people want to type in the chat as they're leaving, if there's one idea in here they're excited to try, they could do that as a little goodbye. And thank you all. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.